It's been 2 or 3 weeks since I posted an update on my progress with my 286 build. As a reminder, I've been working on trying to get the FreeDOS kernel to completely load and initialize on my system. And on one hand, I'd say I've not made any progress because I still have not been able to get that kernel to successfully load. I get quite a ways through the loading process, but I fail to get past the point where I'm trying to validate and see if there is an fdconfig.sys file. Something during that process in calling one of the drivers for that disk fails, and I think it's because it's got a bad pointer to something that it's supposed to be using for part of that set of calls to my driver, to the driver in FreeDOS to get to my disk. I don't think it's a disk issue. I don't think it's related to code for me reading or anything from the disk itself, but there's something else pointer-wise that's getting messed up, either properly not being populated or somehow getting messed up, corrupted prior to it getting used. But the progress I have made, even though I don't have that kernel loaded yet, I've been spending quite a bit of time just trying to understand how does FreeDOS have all the source code? How is it all organized from the C code to the assembly code? How is it making calls from C to assembly, and then from any of that making interrupt calls to my BIOS? Also learning about how drivers work at a basic level inside of FreeDOS. That's been critically important, as a lot of the troubleshooting I'm doing is around the calls to these drivers, which seems to be where I'm running into some sort of a problem. I've also spent quite a bit of time going back through all of my BIOS code and just validating, am I somewhere writing to or reading from an incorrect memory location? Is there something I'm doing incorrectly with the stack or whatever it might be? Also validating all my interrupt routines just to make sure that what is being sent out of those is what should be sent out, and I'm not accidentally messing up again maybe some registers that I didn't intend to modify. One of the things I've realized as I was going through my 286 BIOS code is that I did not have a BIOS data area configured. And if you take a look at the screen here, this is from FreeDOS's boot32.asm. They have a basic diagram just showing that the kernel loads at this segment 60 with an offset of 0, so basically a physical address of 600. And these drivers, it seems like they load at physical 700. And then you can see where some of this other stuff, whether it's the original boot sector or a relocated boot sector or the FAT information, where that's going into memory. But the kernel loads at this 600, which means I have to make sure that I don't step on anything from this on up. And so just to make sure that I didn't do that, I did shrink down any requirements for my BIOS for memory it needs for initialization, SPI communication, LCD writing, etc., VGA output, disk I/O, whatever it might be. I shrunk my portion of memory needed as much as I could, and then also made sure that I keep underneath this 60 or 600 physical. And as I was researching, I came across this BIOS data area. And the reason I got to this is because I found that in some of the source code for FreeDOS, it was making direct calls to, or direct reads from certain locations or addresses in memory. And it wasn't very friendly on what those addresses were. So after tracking down a bit, I realized, okay, they're reading addresses within this range. And I eventually got to this BIOS data area information. So the way I understand this is just showing, okay, your first, certain amount of memory is for your interrupt vector table. So in this case, 256 double words, so first K of memory. And then there's maybe a stack that might be used during post and bootstrap. But then really starting at this physical 400 address, so segment 40 offset 0, certain memory locations maybe are expected to have certain information. And I know I'm not using or don't need to use all of this on my system But I'm guessing that if FreeDOS is going out and trying to read or write to a location in this, I better have it set up so that there is space at the right address for whatever might potentially need to be either written there by me or written there by FreeDOS or read back by FreeDOS. So I've done that. I've gone in and in my case, I did a couple of things just within my code. I call a quick little routine called initBDA. And in that, I then basically go in and fill in certain parts of it. For example, I'm going to fill in something at 4010. And if I go back over here and I look at 4010, what I'm filling in is this equipment list flags. And so how many floppies, drives, do I have a math coprocessor, etc. And so I come in here and I set the appropriate values for AH, and here's AH and then AL, and put that into a specific memory location, which I call equipment list. And what I've done is I can come over here into my system and look at my BSS file, which I have set up. You're going to see down here, basically at memory address 4000, this, and I kind of work my way down. And so in this case, I was writing to equipment list. Equipment list is right here. And you can see I've just kind of set aside a data word for that. And it should be at address 4010. So in this case, that would be physical 410. So what I did above that, though, is I just made sure, I gave myself some room for the interrupt vector table. And this was bytes, not double words. So I'm only really giving it a fourth of this space, not the full 1024 bytes. But then I take another 512 bytes and just set it aside for this temporary buffer that I only use during post. So as soon as that's done, FreeDOS can overwrite this with other interrupt vector table information above this 256. That's fine. And then there's another 256 that I just squeezed in some of my own variables, stuff that I'm using for tracking some disk information or managing printing to my VGA or my mouse or whatever it might be. So all of that is within the first 1024K, and I think that's okay. I don't think FreeDOS is using anything above some of the lower interrupts anyways. And I did initially have this a bit higher. I did try also starting this at physical address 400 to get it above the interrupt vector table potential. And that I didn't necessarily see any difference with that, but I did get it out of other space it was in previously, which was higher and likely was interfering with where FreeDOS was trying to use some of the memory for its kernel, etc. So I think for now I'm okay on this. And really what I've done then is I've taken this space down here before this 60:0. The first 40 of that, so up to 0040 is the interrupt vector table. So between that and 0060, so going from 40 to 60, I've squeezed in anything that I need, I guess, as far as this BDA is concerned. And then even prior to that, earlier below the 40 is where I've squeezed in at the very top some of my specific BIOS code. And maybe I could document that a little bit here and just say that, okay, inside of this, I have some of my own BIOS code. And maybe let me just mark that there is a mark here at 40. And that's where this BDA should be at. So I might just, this is probably fine the way it is. So maybe I'll just mark BDA here. So my BIOS data area. And that really is starting at 40. And then I have my interrupt vector table. And the way that is set up, I'm just going to put in a couple of spaces here. So at the very bottom here, I've got my interrupt vector table, which should go all the way up to 40. But I am squeezing into the top part of that, really starting let's say here at 20, I'm using that for a temporary buffer for reading the info from my SD card, like manufacturer, etc. And then right above that, I am squeezing in at 30 just some BIOS variables. And that might have to do with VGA variables or SPI or disk, etc. But this is just my own BIOS variable data that I need. And I wanted to get that out of where this needs to be for the BDA, because that's really going to chew up from 40 on up to at least 50, if not slightly above, it looks like. Now, once I get up and running, the interrupt vector table can chew up all of this space all the way to 30, and I have no concerns whatsoever. And it's just if I ever need that upper 30 to 40 in this interrupt vector table, then I have to probably do something different with my BIOS variables. I don't think that's an issue for now. But I did go over to the BSS file and I said, okay, let's just make sure we get all of this first K set aside. So what you see from here all the way down to here should be that first set of space that would normally be just for the interrupt vector table, worst case scenario. So going to physical address of 400, the first 1K. And that's if I'm tracking all of these numbers correctly in my head as I'm saying this. But then this should be the first variable that is at 40:0:00 or physical 400. And then I've laid this out just basically to say I want to set aside memory, and some of the locations I gave a name to, other places I just reserved some memory. But then during my initialization, when my BIOS boots up, I run through this init BDA and I initialize some of these that I think I probably need to have initialized, like what's my memory size and some keyboard flags and other things like that, current video mode, anything that looked like FreeDOS might be calling it or might be things that I could fill in right away. So I fill those in. And that way when FreeDOS comes out and says, okay, tell me about the keyboard and is it an enhanced keyboard or not, it can pull that from here accordingly. Or if I have an interrupt that pulls how much memory does my system offer, I can come read that from this location of memory. But it appears that this is a pretty standard place that this stuff should be at. So that's what I'm doing here, is I'm essentially just saying what does this documentation show me, and I'm trying to set aside that memory the best I can so that I don't step on it. So that's been helpful. And then along with that, again, going back to my interrupts and all of my other code, just to make sure that I'm not misusing a data segment or the extra segment, possibly having those incorrectly set because an interrupt happened. Previously in my code, I didn't have to worry about interrupts from something outside of the first 64K of memory, but that is no longer the case as FreeDOS is now loading and doing its thing. It's coming in and maybe setting my data segment or extra segment to something different than 0. So I've just got to be much more careful in all of my routines to pay attention to where is my data segment, where's my extra segment pointing to. And I'm still learning my way through this, but it seems much cleaner at this point. So then I can maybe show you my system booting up here. So here I have two screens. One is on the left, that is the VGA output of my 286 build. The right one is just a serial debug output that I'm using. And as my system boots, I've reduced the clock speed a little bit just to make sure I'm not running any weird issues where the clock is pushing my system too fast. So I think I'm running, let's see, maybe a roughly 6 megahertz CPU, 12 megahertz bus for this specific build. And I've injected a lot of extra debug output so that I can really kind of see what's going on as FreeDOS is going through its initialization, including at what address are different things at, where is my stack pointer pointing to what are the different addresses for things that are happening as I go. And on the debug screen on the right, you might see like these outputs where it says 11 or 16 or 1A. Those are interrupt calls that are being received by my BIOS, coming from FreeDOS, of course. And I just show what's coming in for those interrupts and what am I sending back out of those interrupts. And I can use that just to validate, well, what interrupts are there and what's coming in for the request and what am I sending back. And if I hit an interrupt that I don't have supported, it'll then also throw a message and beep at me to say you don't have this interrupt supported. Here's an interesting thing I'm running into though, and you can see where it says drive param chs.heads : and there's a value. It's kind of weird. In FreeDOS, it's going to go ahead and make a call to my BIOS and ask for information about my disk, and then it gets it back, and it should be that I have 993 cylinders, 16 heads, and 63 sectors. And it gets that back, and then it tries to write it into a structure, basically, in C. But for some reason, one of the values when it gets written, let's see, it would be my sectors, it is trashing the value that was previously written for the heads. And as I've looked into this, I've done some just adding of this debug code to kind of write out the values as it's going, keep writing out the value of this chs.heads and figure out where did it get messed up. And I tracked it down to, okay, it's when I write the sectors part of a structure that it actually somehow stepped on or somehow impacted my head value. And I'll come back to that in a second. I'll show you a change I made and maybe the problem I think is happening there. But you can see this is continuing to boot. It's initializing all of this file system stuff and getting my serial and printer and aux and con and all this stuff set up, I think is what it's doing as it goes. And it's making calls to read keyboard and check status of keyboard. It's making calls around date and time. You can see there's all kinds of things happening, and I'm only calling out certain locations, writing out some extra debugging information so that I can kind of see what's going on. But this is eventually going to get to the point where I'm going to have to open up this configuration file. And for some reason, when I go to check, does that configuration file exist? And first it just checks to see if the media has been changed, like was it a floppy drive and did it change or something like that. And I think the way I understand the code is the first time the disk gets set up in whatever structure of pointers here, it does mark it as the disk has changed. So it's got to go check, has the disk changed? And if so, it's got to build some structures to represent some stuff about that disk. Here you can see that I'm finally getting to where it's going to go out and check this fdconfig.sys. And so it's going to go do what's called a media check. And that media check should call an interrupt. That interrupt should come back and say, yeah, that the media has not been changed, at least from my BIOS perspective. But when I go to make that call, it seems like my stack pointer points to some memory that has a goofy address in it. It has an address way outside of anything that FreeDOS should be able to use. And that's that A83A:0E18. So something wrong with that. So this other issue I was running into with the struct, here what I'm going to do is I'm going to edit and go modify that struct. And so there's a file here called device.h. It's a header file. And I'm just going to throw some blank space in between cylinders and head. And that way, just to see, is this something, maybe an alignment issue with the way that FreeDOS is packing the structures? That CHS is inside of something else about overall disk status or disk information as far as a structure. But if I put in this extra space and then I rebuild the kernel and I copy that over the network to a location that I can now put into my CF card. So I copy that over to my CF card. And I then take that CF card, put it back into my 286 and boot up. And now I'll fast forward to maybe that same location where we start to see the logged output. And what you're going to see now is that after I make that change to the struct, here you can see that the head values stay correct at 16. So it doesn't get messed up when I go assign a new value for sectors. And so I guess in my mind, that makes me think maybe there's just something with the alignment or how those structs are being packed. And I'm, again, no expert in C or assembly, but the research I'm doing, it seems like maybe that has something to do with it. And maybe it's a configuration issue and how I've set up my build. And maybe there's some simple config option that should make this better. One of the things I did find was for Watcom, there is a ZP flag when you build, and everything that I found says that needs to be set to 1, which it is. That's the default in the FreeDOS download the source code. So that is set correctly. So I don't know what's going on there, and I did throw a question out to the listserv for FreeDOS development, and I'll see if anybody has any ideas there, or if any of you watching this have ideas of things I ought to check. Let me know. But it seems like it's some type of alignment issue, and I would think that's within the C or assembly or the build configuration within FreeDOS. Possibly there's something in my BIOS that could affect that, and I'm not sure what that would be. I have tried changing my BIOS just to see if it made a difference from byte aligned to word aligned and back. That didn't make a difference. So I don't know what's going on there. But that's something I gotta get past before I can properly validate that there's no fdconfig sys, so my kernel can keep on booting after that. Because right now, when it goes to do that validation, it's jumping to a weird location that it shouldn't be, and then of course the whole thing falls apart at that point. So that's really all I have for now. Just a short video. This is the type of stuff I'm working on. I've just been spending time inside of all the FreeDOS source code, trying to understand the flow, adding in debug output kind of as I go to kind of understand that, okay, this is calling this, it's calling that, and then eventually getting to these device driver type of calls, which then eventually should get to interrupt calls. And I think everything looks pretty good as I'm booting up, except for the point where I have to make this call to check the media for this fdconfig.sys, and that's where it's pointing to some weird location, and I have not been able to track down what populates that location. So like here, as you're seeing on the screen, it's showing that it's trying to go to, I think, A9, 3A, 2E18. So if that's the segment and the offset, that puts it up in an address space that there's no way it should be touching. And so I've got to figure out why did it get a pointer to that location. I would say this is extremely time consuming. The things that I would think should go much faster, it's just been a little thing after a little thing that I found, clean up a little thing in my BIOS, clean up something else in my BIOS, learn a little bit more about FreeDOS. I don't think any of these issues are FreeDOS issues. Of course, this is either my build configuration for FreeDOS is misconfigured, or there's maybe something with Watcom or some of the tools I'm using. Maybe I have a bug in one of those. I need to grab a different version. I think I'm running the latest version still, though. Or this is something in my BIOS causing an issue. Or maybe it's even something outside of that. Maybe there's some hardware-related issue that's causing this. It doesn't seem like that's the case. Right now, my feeling is that there's some type of alignment configuration thing that maybe is causing me some trouble. But I'll keep working at this. It's a slow grind, but hopefully sometime here in the next couple of weeks in June, I'll get through this, getting the kernel loaded. And then from there, I have a lot of work. I still need to go back and clean up my keyword interrupt code and match the functionality expected by FreeDOS for that. There's some character map stuff that there's an interrupt call about character map or character table that I need to do something with. For now, I'm just kind of faking that. There's also stuff around the clock, the date and time, and I need to do a little bit more work with that. So if I can get through the kernel and I can get some of these other interrupt things, which I think are easy things to do, I just have to do it. Hopefully then that'll get me to the point where I can get to a C prompt booting up from the kernel. So more to come as I learn more. And as always, if any of you are thinking of things that might be causing the type of issue I'm seeing where I'm getting a messed up pointer to something that isn't getting me to the right driver within FreeDOS, or this possibly related symptom where I have one part of a struct being updated that's messing up a different part of the struct, again, possibly an alignment issue. But if anybody has ideas, things I should check or try, whether it's in build configuration, source code configuration, something else, I would love to hear it. So thank you all, and more to come.